be screwed, feel my own adrenaline. Yeah, I do just what I do, and I hope you let me in, yeah.
Hello and welcome back, fellow anime lovers, to Cypherfics. I am delighted to have you join us once again in the world of fanfiction and fantasy. This is the 51st part of, What If Harry Potter Meets My Little Pony? Special note, this fanfic is written and a masterpiece of tkepner on fanfiction.net. Do check and support the author too. Now smash the like, share and subscribe button for more. Also press the bell icon so that you never miss such great parts. Thanks for the introduction. Now let's dive into the world. It was the royal visit to top all royal visits. Elizabeth II, by the grace of God of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and of her other realms and territories, Queen, head of the Commonwealth, and defender of the faith, was going to be meeting with the co-rulers of not just another nation, but the co-rulers of a nation on another planet. The equestrian princesses Celestia and Luna were going to come to Earth to meet with the Queen. Second Lieutenant Castor James Searle swore he was going to be bald by his next birthday. To say that the newspapers and video journalists were excited was a huge understatement. It almost overshadowed England's upcoming first planned manned mission to the moon. Watching the Buran, Britain's own space plane, race down the runway for its first orbital flight had galvanized national pride in a way nothing had done since the Blitz. Yes, the Buran was Russian-made, but it was now fully and completely Britain's. Britain's own scientists and technicians had been all over the shuttle, and improved it beyond its builders' wildest dreams. No giant booster was now necessary, it could fly like a true plane. The Yanks were practically drooling at the prospect, and their efforts to be included in the project were getting downright ludicrous and hilarious. They had already caught one selenographer trying to sneak aboard the space plane with the absolutely ridiculous idea of being a stowaway. He had a trunk-sized rucksack filled with concentrated food, and a home-built spacesuit with a CO2 scrubber/rebreather. How he expected to remain undetected mystified everyone. The announcement that the rulers of the UK's newest ally were coming for a personal visit had driven that fervor to a higher pitch. The equestrians had freely shared their medical knowledge to provide a cure for cancer, as well as the ability to regrow lost limbs. It was their technology, freely shared, that had moved the UK to the forefront of the space race, and made possible automotive and industrial air scrubbers so efficient that the common man already could see the difference in air quality. The automotive and lorry manufacturers Morgan, Caterham, and McLaren, were rumored about to release new models that incorporated several of those technologies. Automotive journalists who had seen advanced models were agog over what they had seen: roomier interiors, greater mileage, better safety features. They even had witnessed one of the new models in a crash test at 100 km per hour, with no damage to the test dummy and only minor scratches to the vehicle. Then there were the motorhome and semi-trailer manufacturers. Devon Conversions, Auto Sleepers, Bilbo, Swift Group, Away Days, and Lawrence David, among others, were all introducing models that incorporated some aspect of the undetectable expansion technology. Different models included different sizes. The government was limiting the sizes of expansion available to keep other governments and citizens from panicking at the actual potential of the charm, Castor knew. Everyone thought it had a maximum limit of triple the original size. Careful design of the runes, with a lot of red herrings, made it nearly impossible for someone to decipher exactly what the limit was. Hiding part of the runes as the actual vehicle logo made it impossible to simply duplicate the vehicle. Sure, Ford could copy the McLaren version. But then trying to sell a vehicle as a Ford when it proudly proclaimed on the hood and bonnet that it was a McLaren was a simple no-go. Not to mention the various international trademark agreements that would violate. Even the tip trucks had gotten involved, with Hester introducing trucks with triple the normal capacity, odor control, and ultra-clean operation. Naturally, they all had the same safety features as the passenger vehicles. The rest of the world was stunned. Of course, the Queen would invite the princesses. Castor swore he was a victim of the 3 Chinese life curses. First was, "May your wishes be granted." He had wished for a respite from tiresome police paperwork. He had certainly gotten that wish. Castor had been the very first government officer that the equestrians had met last year. Just a year ago, he had been a detective inspector in the Surrey Constabulary, a relatively sedate occupation, although with an exorbitant amount of paperwork, in his opinion. Prior to that position, he had been a sergeant in the Special Air Service, the SAS, the Sport and Social, as the members called it, before he retired for the much more mundane constabulary. Immediately realizing he was way over his pay grade, he had bucked his discovery up to one of his former commanders in the military. He had, ultimately, bucked it up to the Prime Minister. The second curse was, "May you live in interesting times." Bucking it upstairs had backfired on him. He had been reactivated as an officer in military intelligence. What an oxymoron that was. Department 5, and then assigned as concierge to the equestrians. No more pedestrian police work for him, no siree. So, concierge he was. Half his time was spent arranging visits to museums and theaters for the various scientists, and Twilight, a member of the royal family who, apparently, had been put in charge of the first contact on her side of the portal. Not to mention he had to get the teams of both pony and British scientists, technicians, and experts introduced and working together. He had even had a staff, now. One of whom was on site at the equestrian embassy to answer the simpler questions, and direct inquiries, leaving only the more difficult ones for him to field or arrange. Being made the main point of contact to the ponies would never be boring. The third curse was, "May people in high places know your name." The Queen had invited the two co-rulers to visit, which fell directly into his bailiwick. Princesses Celestia and Luna. You can't get much higher than the ruling royals of two worlds not only knowing your name, but knew you by sight. As if dealing with the equestrians, for him, wasn't already like herding cats. He had no doubts that before it got much further along, not only would it be Celestia and Luna, but Twilight and the others in the main six would want to be involved, too. Twilight would probably insist that Harry and his friends be dragged along, too. Twilight. Well, he wasn't sure that she had attention deficit disorder, but sometimes she sure acted like it. Or, maybe, attention deficit hyperactive disorder. Plus, while the Queen's staff, and both MI5 and MI6, were well versed in the intricacies of dealing with an official state visit, the problems introduced by the equestrians' very alienness was the issue. The arrival ceremony usually took place on the Horse Guards parade. Yeah, they really didn't want the pony equestrians being treated to a parade of horses being ridden by the Queen's Guard. They would have to use Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle, but those were more restrictive sites in terms of viewers. However, he knew this would have maximum attendance. Perhaps they could use 2 of the 5 regiments of Foot Guards, Grenadier Guards, Coldstream Guards, Scots Guards, Irish Guards, and the Welsh Guards. If everything was on foot, maybe they could use a portion of each of the regiments, otherwise the equestrians might question why the others were left out. Considering their EUP guards, that might be a better option. Then there was the food. How would the princesses appear? As ponies? Or human? Or would they do both at different times? The royal cooks were sure to lose their minds when they saw some of the equestrian menus: hay fries and hay burgers. Vegetarian would have to be the watchword. He'd heard the ponies had tried tofu, only to have their predator griffins declare it a chemical weapon. It gave them extreme intestinal gas problems, which they had discovered when it had cleared out the Canterlot Palace banquet hall at the one event they had tried serving it to the meat-eaters. Although, the ponies didn't mind fish being served. He would have to consult with Princess Twilight. Castor was a bundle of nerves. The bigwigs on the equestrian side were enough of a headache, all 3 princesses, plus Prince Blueblood. He had met the sister princesses in Equestria more than once, primarily at the Grand Galloping Gala, and other such events. The ambassador and Twilight he had met far more frequently. No, it was the litany of English nobility that had him ready to melt into a puddle of anxiety. A special open-air pavilion had been set up in front of the equestrian embassy for the first meeting of the monarchs. It was surrounded on 3 sides by the press corps. There was very nearly at least one reporter and cameraman from every country in the world with bleachers for selected guests to watch this first, historic meeting. Castor was waiting patiently and nervously outside the portal dome that kept the portal, and a small area around it, isolated. With him were several of the embassy staff, eager to meet their princesses. His first impression at seeing the princesses exit the portal, escorted by Blue Blood and the local equestrian guards, was that they were much bigger than he had ever thought. The surreptitious pictures taken by MI5 last year had made Luna look a bit smaller than she really was, having only other humanized ponies present in the photo. While Twilight was slightly taller than an average person, Princess Luna was at least 2.5 meters tall. The third princess was at least another meter. Fortunately, M.I.5 had made the rather prudent decision to customize the interior of the Land Rover they would be using, and erred on the side of deliberately overestimating the possible sizes of their visitors. The inside of that particular vehicle provided enough room for 30 people, with a ceiling that was 4 meters high. "Your Majesties," he said, bowing deeply to the equestrians as they left the portal dome and turned their attention to him. "Everything is set according to the schedule we sent you. The Queen and her entourage are waiting in a pavilion in front of the embassy. After introductions, we'll take a Land Rover to Trafalgar Square, where we will transfer to carriages and take them all to Buckingham Palace. The mall will provide the populace to see you and the Queen." All 4 nodded, and followed him as he headed into the back doors of the embassy. The introductions were the worst. He had spent an entire day practicing until the words began to sound much less than a stilted speech and more natural. That still didn't prevent him from sweating and being nervous. He could see the shock in the Queen's eyes, and everyone else's, at the 2 physically imposing princesses as they exited the embassy proper. There was a collective gasp from the press people privileged to attend. Then there was an almost physical wave of clicks as the camera operators went into full picture-taking mode. They had seen Twilight, or pictures of her, as she had traveled around England with her people, but that the other 2 princesses were so tall and heavily muscled was a surprise. They looked more like fantasy Amazons than just people. The tremendous sword slung across Luna's back did nothing to dispel that image. Neither did the gold bracers, greaves, and chestplate she wore over her black shift, all of which were heavily decorated with moon phases, complex designs, and gems that appeared as stars. The shift was heavily decorated in gold thread in similar patterns. Celestia was not nearly as warrior-like, wearing a similar shift, but in white, with designs that reflected her relationship with the sun. Celestia and Twilight wore crowns of gold, while Luna's was black. They walked to the waiting entourage. The noise of the crowd was still loud. Princess Celestia frowned delicately as she looked at the hundreds of photographers and videographers that formed a horseshoe cordon around the open pavilion. She smiled slightly at seeing the 4 embassy unicorns at the posts holding the canvas up, watching the crowd intently and ignoring her presence completely. "Well," she said, just barely loud enough to be heard over their audience, "this is slightly annoying." She stood still for a moment and the sound gradually subsided to a mere whisper. The Queen didn't react, but several members of her staff stared around in surprise. "There, now," Celestia said happily, "that's better. Now we can hear ourselves think." She looked at the Queen. "They can still hear us quite clearly, so do be careful of what you say." Castor nervously cleared his throat. "Your Majesty," he said, addressing the Queen. "I am pleased to present," he swept his arm towards the Princess in White, "Her Eternal Majesty, Princess Celestia, Mstrs of the Invincible and Unconquered Sun, Bringer of the Day, Destroyer of Monsters, Bane of Evil, Guiding Hoof of the Realm, Monarch of Unicorns, Counselor of Earth Ponies, Commander of the Pegasi, Matriarch of the Night Ponies, and co-ruler of Equestria and all their other realms and territories." The Queen murmured a quiet, "Welcome to the United Kingdom." To which the princess nodded her head gracefully. Continuing, Castor turned to the Princess in Black. "I am also pleased to present Her Eternal Majesty, Princess Luna, Mstrs of the Stars and Moon, Bringer of the Night, Guardian of Dreams and Destroyer of Nightmares, Bane of Evil, Defender and Grand General of the Realm, Matriarch of the Night Ponies, monarch of unicorns, counselor of earth ponies, commander of the Pegasi, and co-ruler of Equestria and all their other realms and territories. There was another brief exchange of pleasantries. "It is my pleasure to present," he said, switching his attention to the princess in purple, Her Royal Highness, Twilight Sparkle, Princess of Friendship, Mstrs of Magic, Bearer of the Element of Magic, Savior of Equestria, Liberator of the Crystal Empire, biggest egghead ever. Twilight rolled her eyes and made a face. The other two princesses just smiled at her. "I hate that title," she murmured. "I can't believe you did that," she said, glaring at her mentor. Ignoring the byplay, Castor turned to the lone male. "And finally, may I present Prince Blueblood Platinum, Duke of Paradise Valley, Ambassador to the United Kingdom. Princesses, Prince," he turned to the Queen, "I present to you Elizabeth II, by the grace of God, of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and of her other realms and territories, Queen, head of the Commonwealth, Defender of the Faith." He then introduced the rest of entourage, starting with her husband, Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. Then came Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, Prince Charles, Prince of Wales and Duke of Cornwall, and his wife Princess Diana, Princess of Wales. Her other three children, Princes Edward, Earl of Wessex, Andrew, Duke of York, and Princess Anne, Princess Royal. Princesses Celestia and Luna made the appropriate responses in greeting each individual as they were introduced. There, it was done. He had managed to make it through without once bollocksing it up. He stepped back and tried to become invisible. "Welcome to our world," the Queen warmly said. "We had never suspected that a portal to your world existed in our realm." She glanced around. In fact, our advisors had never even suggested such portals could exist. Princess Celestia smiled down at her. "While we have known of portals for millennia, the realms to which they led were almost invariably violently hostile. Had we known we would get such a warm and welcoming reception in this one, we might have pursued the subject a bit more diligently." She glanced around at the entourage. "The truth is, we recently discovered this portal completely by accident, a most fortuitous accident, if we may say so." She gave a sidelong glance at her sister. "Yes," agreed Luna. "Having another species to share our discoveries with is a welcome change from our world. Most of our neighbors in Equus used to view us solely as a food source." She gave them a smug smile. "They learned the error of their ways thousands of years ago. Despite that, we cannot freely share what we know with them." "Discovering this portal was a delight," Celestia said. "You have a rich culture. We are especially taken with your Shakespeare." She gave Luna another sidelong glance. "Our sister prefers Monty Python and Benny Hill." "We were greatly saddened to hear of his demise earlier this year," Luna said sorrowfully. "Our faithful student, Twilight, on the other hoof, prefers Dorothy L. Sayers, Agatha Christie, and P.D. James." Princess Twilight was blushing. "This, of course, is part and parcel with your inquisitive natures. You have delved into areas of science that we never dreamed of considering, such as your aeroplanes, television, radio, or even your internal combustion engines." The Queen nodded and smiled. "And you have delved into areas we never considered," she said. "As your cures for cancer, and other diseases, have shown. For someone to regrow a lost limb was a hopeless dream to our researchers, but you have made it a reality. Plus, there are dozens of other innovations you have shown us that will inspire new discoveries leading to new fields of research. Our recent mission to our moon is one such innovation." Luna straightened at the mention of the moon. "Yes," she said, nodding. "I thank you for your generous gift of material from your moon. It is both different and yet similar to our own. I look forward to seeing it tonight." The Queen blinked, surprised. "You do not have to wait to see it, Princess Luna," she said, nodding her head to one side. "It has already risen." "Forsooth." 1 second there was a tall woman standing there, then abruptly there was a dark blue horned and winged horse in her place. Almost immediately, with a single flap of her wings, she was outside the pavilion and hovering as she stared at the wisp of a moon not far from the sun. Sister. Come look. The sun and the moon do share the sky without conflict, she called excitedly. Twilight was shaking her head wryly. I told her that. Celestia gave Twilight a warm look. Yes, you did, but Luna suspected that there was more tenseness involved than you could detect. She turned and called out sternly, Luna. But, Tia, she gestured at the moon as she glanced back under the pavilion and sighed. She looked back up and shook her head. You poor thing, she murmured. She turned back to the pavilion and flew to her sister's side, landing lightly. In her normal form, her eyes were about neck level with the queen. She shook her shoulders. Yes, she said quietly, this is much more comfortable. She smirked at the queen. For both of us, we would guess. Yes. The queen's lips quirked slightly, as if she were holding back her own smile, but she did give a slight nod as she examined the alicorn. Her arm and leg bracers and greaves had changed to become metallic shoes that covered the hooves and fronts of the pastern bones. Her chest armor had become an armored patral. All were as intricately decorated as before, with the quarter moon as a theme. Celestia nodded. Yes, now that the formal formalities have been observed, perhaps it would be better. She transformed to her alicorn form. She was only a finger's width taller than the queen. If she relaxed her neck a tiny bit, they could see eye to eye. Twilight followed suit. Considering how much taller everyone else was to the queen, she was the shortest person there. It was probably refreshing to not always be looking up to see someone's expression. After a few minutes posing for the photographers, the queen, her entourage, and the princesses climbed into the queen's specially modified Land Rover and they left for the official ride down the mall to Buckingham Palace. The interior of the Land Rover had been heavily modified. It now resembled a room in the palace, albeit rectangular instead of square, with more than adequate seating for the entire group to comfortably speak to each other. Castor had warned the staff that the princesses might return to their native form, and suitable pillows had been swapped for their seats before they had boarded the vehicle. The queen looked at the three princesses after they were all seated. Luna had elected to sit by a window and was even now looking raptly up at the sun and moon overhead. According to what I have been told, the queen said after taking a sip of her tea, you will be staying here for 3 days. She raised an eyebrow inquisitively. Celestia nodded amiably. Yes, Luna and I are quite looking forward to the vacation. It is our first in millennia. There was a stunned silence. The books they had secured had indicated that Celestia had been in charge for centuries, but they had not been sure if that was true. It had been possible that it was a series of ponies named Celestia, much like the Dalai Lama in Tibet, where the death of the current monk started a search for his reincarnated soul, who then ruled as the continuation of the Dalai Lama. Elizabeth carefully placed her cup on the small table at her elbow. Are you immortal? There was a very slight tremor to her voice. Celestia shook her head. No one is immortal, we are just extremely difficult to kill. She glanced out the window. I draw my strength from the sun. Luna draws hers from the moons and planets. I imagine that I will pass on when my sun dies. Luna will do the same when her moons and planets are no longer able to generate their magic. She turned back to them and smiled warmly. I had never contemplated just how long that might be until we acquired some of your textbooks. From your books on astronomy, that will probably not be for many billions of years. She looked out the window again with a strangely blank expression. She abruptly shook her head. Unless, of course, magic has another ending in mind for us. There was a profound silence for several minutes. Elizabeth took another sip of tea and set her cup back down. She sighed, then looked Celestia in the eyes. You are responsible for the raising and lowering of your sun and moon. She looked at them questioningly. Celestia gave her a sweet smile. Yes. I raise and lower the sun whilst my sister does the same for the moon. Then, if I may ask, how will that be managed in your absence? Or were you planning on returning to Equestria every evening and morning? Twilight gave her mentor a questioning look. She clearly had not been advised, either. Celestia smiled, more to herself than anyone else. Luna proved she had been listening by giving a short snort of amusement. As I said, this is our first vacation in millennia. So, that chore is being handled by some pony who is well suited to the task. It will be good practice for her. In Crystal City, a certain pink pony had just passed out and was lying on the floor beside her breakfast table. Maids were rushing around in a panic while her husband hurried to her side and called for a doctor. Her Royal Highness, mi amore Cadenza, Princess of Love, Mstrs of Heavenly Affection, Earthly Passion, and Icon of Eros, Guardian of the Crystal Heart, Niece of the Heavens, Liberator and Ruler of the Crystal Empire aka Princess Cadance, as she preferred had just received what she thought of as dreadful and horrific news. The princess had been calm and happy to see Philomena the Phoenix when she first flamed into their breakfast room. While her aunts, the royal sisters, frequently sent her messages, most came by regular postmail. The official, wax stamp on the missive was a bit unusual, but nothing to be concerned about, it just meant this wasn't a simple note gleefully recounting Celestia's latest prank on Luna, or vice versa. She had opened it and began reading. She had paled, her pink fur turning almost white, a faint feeling of horror wafted through the room. Her husband, Prince Shining Armor, on the other side of their breakfast table, had quizzically stared at her uncharacteristic reaction. "Is something wrong?" he had asked worriedly. She had looked up at him when she had reached the end of the letter. Her eyes wide in terror and shock, she had started hyperventilating. "Tia and Lulu want me," she had said as she stared at Shining in rising panic, "to raise and lower the sun and moon while they visit the Queen of England on the other side of the portal for the next few days." By the time she had reached the final words she was shrieking, and the pupils of her eyes were mere pinpricks. "Starting tonight." Her eyes had rolled up, and down she went. Hence, the alicorn currently passed out on the floor, and the panic that was rather quickly enveloping the Crystal Empire. Who were left to wonder, what could be so terrible as to cause their empress to collapse when meeting King Sombra hadn't done that? Somewhere outside of both realities, Discord had fallen out of his armchair, spilling popcorn everywhere as he guffawed in delight. "Celestia strikes again," he finally gasped, before descending into another bout of laughter. Twilight frowned a moment, then gasped and protested, "You didn't." She stared at her mentor. Celestia raised an eyebrow in return as she sipped her tea. Twilight put both hooves over her face. Luna sighed, and looked over from her window seat. "Princess Cadance has observed our sister doing those chores several hundred times. She is more than capable of doing it herself." She stared at Twilight. "As can you," she added mildly. "You simply lack practice. The first few times are hardest, until you earn their trust." The humans in the room looked at Twilight with a new respect. They had read that there were 4 princesses, with the absent princess being the ruler of the Crystal Empire. The history of Equestria read like a fantasy story with magic and outrageous villains. At first, they had believed them to be exaggerations, but the more reports that poured in from their people on the other side of the portal, the more likely those stories became. "What do you mean, earn their trust?" the Queen asked. Celestia turned her attention back to the Queen, her smirk turning into smile. "Our sun is not simply a ball of gas and nor our moon a collection of rock, as your books tell us you regard your sun and moon. They react to our presence. She frowned. They welcome our touch." The royals exchanged wondering looks. "Your moon, there is something there, but we can't reach it yet," Luna said, musing, as she stared out the window. "Perhaps, when sunset arrives, we shall find out more." The rest of the short trip to the square was quiet as they drank their tea and the humans contemplated the concept that stars and moons might be, in some way, alive. Which meant planets were, too. Was the idea of Mother Gaia not the fanciful lark many supposed, but based in a reality none had ever understood? Once they arrived at Trafalgar Square, the Queen and the princesses transferred to an official state carriage, a 1902 Ascot Landau carriage with fold-down top. The plan was for them to be escorted by the household cavalry, with street liners coming from the foot guards. Union flags and the flags of Equestria were draped on both sides of the road. Castor had never thought the royals would be interested in seeing the Queen's mounted household cavalry. He hoped it wouldn't turn into a problem. The rest would motor on to the palace. Naturally, the sisters stalled that plan. Celestia and Luna made straight for the 6 gray-white horses hitched to the open-air carriage. The weather was cooperating, for once. The horses were well-trained, and only shuffled awkwardly in their HRNSS as the 2 smaller horses with points on their heads and wings flew over to them. Twilight followed more slowly on foot, staring with wide eyes at the 3 postilions seated on the left side horses. The coach had no driver. The Queen and her entourage were all surprised to see that the 3 princesses were blushing as they inspected the 3 men. No, it wasn't the men that had attracted their attention, but their saddles, oddly enough. Twilight had turned an interesting shade of magenta. Luna peppered the horses with questions. What's your rank? How long have you had this job? And, with a sidelong glance back at the saddles, is that comfortable? To the postilion's confusion. The horses just looked at her, their ears twitching. Celestia, meanwhile, had noticed the ranked horse guard before and after the coach. Oh, my, she murmured. So that really is what they're for, she said, studying the saddles of the first rank. Twilight, looking over at the other ranks, gasped and her blush deepened. Celestia, she said, scandalized, are those ponies wearing socks in public? Celestia quickly redirected her gaze, then frowned. She quickly trotted over and leaned closer to one black horse who had white coloring on her rear legs that extended to the bottom of her knees. She straightened. No, she said loudly, smirking, those are actually the color of their coat at that spot. She gave a sly glance to the embarrassed purple pony, and headed back to the carriage. Imagine that, Twilight. What would ponies say if they thought you always wore socks in public? She paused a second. With a saddle. For a moment, Castor thought Twilight turned red all the way to the tip of her tail. Once more, Discord fell out of his armchair, guffawing in delight. Shortly, though, the Queen and the 3 princesses were seated in the coach, and the procession started off at a slow walk. Twilight slowly returned to her normal purple coat, though still tinged with a hint of red. She steadfastly refused to look at the horses in front and behind them, instead focusing on the huge crowd that stood lining the road to Buckingham Palace. The princesses sat much higher on their seats than did the Queen, which gave the packed throng a clear view of them. The sisters sat in the front, facing backwards, while the Queen and Twilight sat in the back. Castor and the others headed for the palace via a different route. He knew that the princesses had seen the many books about horses, but the reason for their reactions must be the difference between reading about something that seemed fantastic and seeing it in real life, up close. Castor and the rest of the Queen's entourage knew the moment when the royal carriage arrived. The booming sounds of the 41-gun salute from the cannons in Green Park, with the simultaneous 62-gun salute from the cannons in the Tower of London and City of London, welcomed the princesses. In a break with tradition, the Guard of Honor for the event did comprise of senior members of all 5 House Guard regiments. It was all a great deal of pomp and circumstance as the Queen and her guests stood on the steps of the forecourt of Buckingham Palace. To the watching public's surprise, as the equestrian national anthem was played, the 3 princesses stood upright on their hind legs, with their wings spread wide. Twilight was in front of and centered between the other 2. The storm of cameras clicking at the impressive sight was not unexpected. They returned to the ground, momentarily, as the band prepared for the next anthem. As God Save the Queen started, they again stood upright and spread their wings. This time, though, in a move that surprised even the Queen, Celestia and Luna shifted to stand behind the Queen and her husband. Twilight moved down the steps to form a triangle around England's royal couple without blocking them. It made for a striking picture that graced the front page of almost every newspaper in the world. The other governments, and most people, took it as a very public statement of solidarity and friendship between the nations. No one would be surprised when a mutual aid treaty was announced the next day. At the end of the anthem, the three princesses returned to their positions to the queen's right. The commander of the Guard of Honor formation mounted the steps and said, "Your Majesties, the Guard of Honor, provided by the Grenadier Guards, Coldstream Guards, Scots Guards, Irish Guards, and the Welsh Guards, is formed up, and ready for inspection." They weren't the full regiments, of course, only a row of the most senior soldiers from each unit. While the three princesses walked in front of the guards, the selected band played a slow march. Celestia stopped in the middle of the first row to ask one guard to present his weapon for her inspection. When he held it out, she took it in her magic. She popped out the magazine, checked the firing chamber, and took a look down the barrel. She removed and inspected the bayonet, before sliding everything back together in one move and handing the rifle back to the guard. She thanked the guard, and commended him on his crisp movements and perfect rifle, then they continued down the line. Luna did the same in the second and fourth rows. Twilight did it in the third row, and a long-distance mic picked up her murmur to the guard, "Are you as nervous about this as I am?" Celestia picked someone from the fifth row to conclude the inspection. In a dramatic departure from tradition, behind the foot troops were 5 rows of mounted horse guards. Celestia and Luna took great delight in inspecting the tack the horses were equipped with, and requested several guards to demonstrate proper dismount and mounting techniques. Many of television watchers across the world marveled at how the purple pony could change the color of her coat to magenta, and if it meant anything. Celestia even flew up and briefly stood on one of the saddles. Her comment that, "We have never before mounted such a large stallion," left Twilight bug-eyed, and her sister's coat, dark though it was, still managed to briefly exhibit a slight reddish tinge. Discord was pounding the floor with one hand while laughing so hard he was crying. Oh, the stories he planned to tell Fluttershy. The overheard comment also left a lot of people wondering whether or not they should be scandalized. It was quite some time before Twilight's coat returned to its normal purple shade. Following the formal events of their arrival, the princesses had an informal luncheon with the Queen. Castor had exchanged several letters with Harry Potter regarding what he would recommend as a suitable menu for the princesses. That was, he had decided, later, one of the best ideas he had had for the visit. Harry provided a rather detailed list of things not to offer the princesses, and a smaller list of what each princess appeared to like, or at least, found acceptable, as a lunch item. Castor was rather surprised at the list of bakery items each of the ponies liked best. The little unicorn had even included a few recipes for some of the things the princesses liked, both fish and vegetable. He supplied a few recipes from his school that he said were items served there that he had found good to taste. Then it was on to view the Queen's royal collection of artifacts, and the tradition of exchanging gifts with the royals. When Equestria was first established, there were those who felt we shouldn't be there, or that our ponies were a tasty dinner. Celestia said. It took several centuries, and many lives, before our enemies understood completely the folly of challenging us, and left us in peace. Although some still test us to this day, Luna concluded. Twilight opened one of her saddlebags and removed a sword that was longer than she was. It had a polished shine, with a plain hilt, but had clearly seen use. On closer examination, the oddly shaped, wide, wooden hilt looked to have teeth marks in it. Celestia took it from her and presented it, hilt first, to the Queen of the United Kingdom. Your Majesty, we used many swords in the defense of Equestria against our enemies 2,000 years ago. This sword is one of 3 that have survived. It has rested in a Canterlot vault since those days, a symbol of freedom for ponies. She paused. Should the United Kingdom ever need the aid of Equestria, in any capacity, take this sword in your hand and call for us. We will come. Elizabeth gently reached out to take it. The moment she touched it, the entire sword glowed brightly. A promise has been made, a promise will be kept, Luna and Twilight said as the sword's glow slowly faded. After a moment's silence, the Queen said, "We shall endeavor to be worthy of such a promise, and we will stand by you as you stand by us." That evening was reserved for a state dinner. Around 150 guests were invited to the white tie event at the ballroom in Buckingham Palace for the banquet. Besides the equestrian, the guests included members of the extended royal family, British politicians, and notable figures from both countries, mostly British. The meal featured a wide assortment of dishes featuring fish and pastries stuffed with fish meats. The princesses seemed quite happy with the selection. After the dessert, a variety of cakes was served, the new defense arrangement between the two nations was announced, and the sword exhibited. The next day they toured the stables for the house guard, the royal muse. The queen allowed that with the new, special technology, that the equestrians had made available to them, the stalls for the horses would be greatly enlarged. Currently, they were barely big enough for a horse to turn around or lie down. Then it was on to meetings to discuss how the two countries could further their ties and cooperation. They were in the 1844 room, a room usually reserved for meeting foreign dignitaries. Luna started with, "Thank you for your kind gift of soil from your moon. It's a quiet little thing, but happy that you've chosen to come visit, brief though that was. Are you intending to return?" The queen blinked in surprise, before saying, "It was our pleasure to gift you. It seemed only proper, given your position in Equestria. As for a return," she smiled, "I am reliably informed that several trips are already under consideration." The topics wandered for quite a while, until Celestia said, "I have been told that the air scrubbers you have installed on your power production plants have been producing blocks of solid carbon as a byproduct." She paused to take a sip of her tea. "If you haven't a use, yet, for those, we would be interested in purchasing or trading for them." At the queen's polite look, Celestia explained. "You see, Equestria hasn't any large power plants such as you have here, we instead have used hydroelectric dams to supply our needs. So far, they are well suited for our needs. Pure carbon, as a result, is of limited availability." Queen Elizabeth nodded her understanding. "Might I ask why you want these blocks?" Celestia returned her smile. "Dragon snacks." Prince Philip looked very surprised. "Dragon snacks," he said, wonderingly. "In Equestria, dragons eat gems. They have distinctive tastes, I've been told by our dragon friend, Spike. Rubies tend to be spicy, for example." "And plain carbon?" asked Elizabeth. "Is rather pedestrian. However, it's not so much the carbon we longing, as that we can easily apply a bit of heat and pressure to make diamonds of the blocks." Both royals looked surprised. "The entire block?" "At once," said Philip. Celestia nodded. Although Spike is most interested in experimenting with adding various other elements into the carbon structure to see what tastes he can derive. Twilight snorted. "He just wants a reason to stuff himself on diamonds as the taste tester." The other two princesses laughed. "There is that," Celestia said agreeably. "We see nothing wrong with such an export," the queen said. "Our understanding is that the operators of the facilities regard the carbon as a simple waste material." "What sort of volume did you have in mind?" Celestia rolled her shoulders in a shrug. "At first, only a few tons. After that, probably all of it." In response to their incredulous looks, she said, "Most dragons are large. To a 15-ton dragon, 100 weight of diamonds is the equivalent of a serving of chips for you." She took another sip of her tea. "Dragon's Lair, home of the dragons, could easily consume several tons per day. It would also provide us with a product of interest to the dragons, and induce them into more trade and friendlier relations," put in Luna. The queen shook her head wryly. "Diamonds. As snacks." She looked over to Celestia. "And it is easy for you your ponies to do?" The alicorn nodded. "Not difficult at all. A few seconds, at most." She smiled. "If you could have one of your aides fetch us a sample of coal, I could show you." The queen rang a bell and told the aide who answered what was wanted. The man hurried out. While they waited, they discussed how the efficiency of the air scrubbers, and some of the value the power producers had discovered was in the reclaimed elements. Shortling, Prince Philip suggested, you might be able to convince the power-generating facilities to pay you to take away the carbon blocks. Then he promised his wife that he would take the project under his wing until it was finalized. He promised the princesses that he would have the first few tons collected and delivered within the week. Twilight rolled her eyes. Spike is going to gain so much weight before this is over. The aide finally returned, but with a large box filled with golf ball-sized coal pieces. Excellent. Celestia said, hefting the mass of raw coal out of the box in a light gold aura. Lulu, you handle the excess heat, Chui, you catch the impurities. She looked at the two royals, and smirked. We wouldn't want to make a mess, now, would we? She guided the mass of coal pieces over to a window where the sun was shining in. She carefully stood in the light, with the coal suspended in front of her. She nodded, first to her sister, then to Twilight. As they nodded back, a cobalt blue aura seemed to surround the coal while a pinkish glow seemed to hover below it. The coal clump seemed to be getting smaller and smaller while a tiny rain of particles fell from it. For a brief moment, the clump didn't change size, then it began to brightly glow. As the glow faded, it left behind a hotly glowing cube that had to be nearly 6 inches, 15 centimeters, on a side half as tall as a sheet of A4. There you go, she said. We'll have to let it cool down a bit. Currently the diamond would scorch the table if we set it on it. Even from across the room, they could feel the heat radiating from the block. An aide rushed out of the room. I think that is the perfect paperweight for your desk, Your Majesty. Celestia suggested. Or, perhaps, on the mantel. She looked over to the fireplace. The two royals just stared at the impossibility they had just seen. The 3 equestrians returned to their seats and picked up their cups. Celestia kept the block floating halfway to the ceiling, and well away from anything flammable. They sat in silence for several minutes, just watching the block's glow slowly change. The aide rushed back into the room and carefully placed a large glass plate with RBB feet down on a side table, then placed a shiny metal trivet on top of that. Celestia gave the arrangement a critical look. Luna, could you cool this down a bit? A cobalt blue glow surrounded the diamond for several moments, and they could see the block cooling down as its glow faded from white to yellow to orange. She nodded her thanks to Luna, who cut off her magic. The princess placed the cube on the metal trivet. There, that should do nicely, the white alicorn said. There was a creak. As the trivet heated up under the block. It'll take another hour or so before you'll be able to handle it safely. She sighed and returned to the couch and her tea. Your note asked if we would like to address your parliament, and possibly discuss the possible importance of political, economic, and cultural ties between our two countries. Did you have anything particular in mind? That evening, when Luna came in from watching the moon set, Celestia gently asked, well? 'Tis as I said before. It's a timid little thing. It seemed rather startled that I could touch it. Nothing more, however. Celestia sighed as Twilight watched interestedly. My endeavor was just as disappointing. I can detect something there, but it is disinterested. She gazed out the window. If we were here more permanently, I might be tempted to try harder. She turned back to the room. But this is not my world, nor that my son. It would be rude of me to impose. I will leave it alone and not disturb the balance of the system. The rest of their stay was rather enjoyable. Both senior princesses took great joy in seeing a land and culture that was so dramatically different from their own. When the three were not in meetings with the British Prime Minister at 10 Downing Street, there were meetings with the leader of the opposition, the leaders of all parties in the House of Commons, and members of the British Cabinet. They also toured the British Museum, National Gallery, Natural History Museum, and Buckingham Palace. They also managed a quick trip to Blackpool, and a look at the piers and Ferris wheel. They also examined the proposed site for their second portal. Returning to Equestria, for the sisters, was a bit of letdown. As it always is when you return home from a vacation. The temptation had been too great for the Pegasi. After the rainstorm on another group of bigots, Harry saw the inevitable next rule posted. 15. No bringing or creating weather inside the castle, without a professor's permission. Don't ask Hagrid for permission. 3 days after meeting with the two changelings in Equestria, James Wooten, MI5's Director General's secretary, waved Castor into Sir Patrick Jeremy Walker's office. Captain Searle, reporting as ordered, sir. He gave the seated man a crisp salute and clicked his heels. The man gave him a sour look. Oh, knock it off, Castor. Castor grinned and sat in the chair to one side of the director's desk. Patrick leaned forward and steepled his hands on his desk. The Prime Minister, and Queen, have considered this matter thoroughly. Given the changelings' abilities at mimicry, they would give us an incalculable advantage in the world against our enemies. And that doesn't even touch how useful one of them would be against homegrown terrorist cells, or even just criminal gangs. The problem is, of course, how do we secure their loyalty? Simply giving them sanctuary isn't enough. The other nations would fight for the privilege if they heard about it. We can't judge them based on human needs, we haven't a clue what they want. Idealism against our enemies won't work as they know nothing of our politics. From what little we know, they aren't covetous of material things, so money and other items won't work. The Prime Minister wants to give the changelings sanctuary, but only if we can guarantee they won't simply disappear into the population or defect to another country. He pursed his lips. There is a method our military special technology experts know that will compel people to keep their word in an oath. It should work with the changelings. He sighed. Castor understood that he meant a spell of some kind worked by a muggle-born wizard, a new magical. The difficulty with that is coming up with wording that will leave the fewest loopholes. Their suggestion never to work against the good of the people or government of the United Kingdom is a good start. Your suggestion that they obey any lawful orders is also well taken. In exchange, we can promise to provide for them and not to abuse their trust in us. Unfortunately, we won't know if the special technology works until it fails to work. Which could have catastrophic consequences. He shook his head. Then there's the possibility that there might be some sort of long-term problem with them feeding on humans. While some of our opponents wouldn't care about that, would even be happy to supply food at the cost of a few of their people, the Queen would be greatly disappointed in us if we allowed that. Well, sir, Castor said, if it's a one-time exposure, based on what the equestrians have been able to glean, there shouldn't be any ill effects at all. I imagine rotating the collector between churches with frequent weddings would fit the bill. We could use the guise of an assistant reporter or wedding arranger. With literally hundreds of locations with multiple weddings per day, in a city the size of London, the odds of the same person being present during 2 weddings are vanishingly small. Or we could put her as a nurse in a hospital in the maternity wards with new mothers. He shrugged. With the 20-some hospitals in London, alone, exposing the regular nurses once a month, and the new families only once, ever, we shouldn't have any problems. Or we could restrict this to military hospitals, that way we could have regular physical and mental checkups on the families. If we did that, we might be able to detect any changes before it becomes a problem, and adjust things accordingly. The disadvantage to that is that it might take decades to pick up on a difference from the control group. Patrick nodded. That's what the Prime Minister reasoned, too. He sighed. The biggest problem, as I have said, is securing the loyalty of the changelings. He opened a folder on his desk and slid a paper to Castor. Here's what we've come up with for the oath. If they refuse, then we have to say no. He frowned. Of course, we won't insist they take the oath until after the equestrians allow them to pass through the portal. He paused. Assuming they do. He stared intently at Castor. Do you really think you can convince Princess Twilight to agree? And that she can convince the other princesses? Castor nodded slowly, looking over the written oath. If you add a line here that they forsake returning to Equestria unless forced or deliberately invited by one of the princesses, I think so. Hermione's birthday on September 19th was a success and a total surprise to her. In a move somewhat reminiscent of Pinkie Pie, the twins had arranged an outrageous party in the Great Hall. It was the first party of the year, the Weasley twins declared, and they wanted to start off with a bang. That it was on a Saturday and they didn't have to wait for the end of classes made their preparations a bit more difficult. Harry and the others in the herd managed to keep the birthday filly distracted during the day as the twins spent the afternoon setting up the Great Hall. Then they hid their efforts behind a few don't notice this spells until it was time for the unveiling. It was easy to distract her, as all they had to do was keep her in the library until it was time for the evening meal. With all 6 of them together working and reading ahead on their assignments, she never thought for a moment that anything was amiss. That all 5 were so agreeable to her suggestion to spend the day inside studying did not raise any suspicion. "I should have known," she said later, shaking her head. She didn't even get suspicious that the Great Hall was as crowded as it was for dinner tonight. There were no late arrivals. Word had circulated earlier in the day that there was to be a party in the Great Hall put on by the twins, and nobody wanted to miss that. Even the Slytherins were unable to muster the will to resist the temptation. The twins' parties had that good of a reputation. Her expression when the twins started casting their finites when it was time for desserts, and banners with balloons and fireworks appeared, was priceless. The long and innuendo-laden birthday song that followed had her blushing almost beet red. That the equestrians had joined in the singing at the 3rd stanza and started dancing on the tables and in the aisles as music filled the room had left the witches and wizards stunned, at first. Then they had been dragged into the dancing and singing by the ponies, who wanted to share the joy. When the song finally faded, everyone in the Great Hall, professors included, were winded and red-faced. That harmony songs might become a steady fixture at Hogwarts was slowly dawning on those students who had participated in one, or more, last year. A giant cake appeared on their table directly in front of her moments after the song ended. It was a rectangular monster that built up in steps to tower over the partiers. She had to climb on the table to get high enough to blow out the candles on the top layer, which, naturally, flared right back up as soon as she thought she had put them out. After the second try, she waved her wand and sent the lit 13 candles chasing after the twins. Ellie sat at the Hufflepuff table beside her 3 cousins. The Hufflepuff table was beside the Gryffindor table, and her current seat as a second year placed her right across from the Cutie Mark Crusaders, who sat with their backs to the Great Hall wall. Naturally, she and her siblings sat with their backs to Harry's herd as they didn't dare draw the ponies' attention. That her 3 cousins sat with her was not remarked upon because everyone knew they were related and she was doing her duty to family by sitting with them. Although, based on how many ponies had come to Hogwarts this year, her 3 siblings might be better off closer to the middle of the rest of the first ties. She was starting to have second thoughts about not having one of them in Ravenclaw and the other in Slytherin. She would keep Earl close in the event he needed help. He was an unpredictable male, after all. She was more than pleased at the feelings she was absorbing from the crowd. The party was as much a surprise to her as it was to most of the people in the hall. She had missed the girls' first party, last year, which had been more of an in-house thing, she guessed. Watching, listening, and feeling the reactions of the 7 second-year animagi had clued her into what was about to happen. Listening closely as they bragged about what they had done told the actual mechanics of preventing the party girl from discovering it too early. Although it was odd to hear Harry keep referring to the human girls in his herd as fillies. She happily applauded with others at the unveiling, cheered as the giant cake appeared, and laughed as the candles chased the twins around the hall. She didn't have to glance at her 3 Lings to know they were surprised at just how raucous the witches and wizards were. Especially as the twins' prank candies, cookies, and gum circulated, causing unusual and sudden, but brief, transformations. The party lasted for several of hours before the professors started herding the students back to their dorms. As soon as Ellie felt the professors' moods become more serious, she immediately chivied her 3 Lings back to the dorm, to beat the rush. Once they were in their dorm, she instructed the others to make jars and offload as much love food as they could, then meet her back in the common room. She knew the Gryffindors would merely continue the party in their dorm. A number of Hufflepuffs followed them as they headed for the secret entrance hole to Gryffindor Tower. Once inside, as she had expected, the raucous party continued. Some couples had already sought out comfortable places for kissing, snogging as they called it here, and for others to jockey for positions in petting the multitude of ponies. For the new students from Equestria, being the center of so much focused attention, starting when they had arrived at Hogwarts, was a giddy feeling. The petting and combing in the common rooms left most of them blissed out. That night was no different. The Lings would have an excellent opportunity to not only gorge themselves, but build a significant stockpile early in the year. Plus, they could use the opportunity to spread the story of their escape from their destroyed village, and gain a bit more emotional support. They had decided that that would be the best course of action regarding the three Lings' history. Their story was that their parents had built a safe room under their home with strict instructions for the children to stay inside for a minimum of a week in the event of disaster. The same disaster, they would claim, that had been sent Ellie out into the wider world, and England. Once they had snuck out of their underground bunker, it had taken them a year longer than Ellie to make their way to England. They knew their great-grandparents had come from there, and that there might be family they could appeal to. Unfortunately, with 3 people, getting out of Papua New Guinea without alerting the magical, or the non-magical, authorities had been quite difficult. They had finally found a family friend who had been willing to help them by arranging plane tickets to England in exchange for the key to their family's vault. It hadn't had much in it, but what there was more than enough to get them out of the country and repay the friend handsomely for the risks he took. On arrival, the goblins had put them in contact with their cousin, Rarity. And the rest was obvious. The 3 were Frnds now, as the witches and wizards at the school liked to call them. While they had access to everything Ellie had learned already, they didn't have the necessary experience with a wand to pull off being second-year students. Knowing how to swing a sword doesn't automatically make one a skilled swordsling, after all. Muscle memory is as important as regular memory. As a result, trying to claim they had been well tutored and could move into second year with Ellie would have probably failed spectacularly as they flubbed the wand movements. On the other hand, this put them in the middle of the mass of ponies that made up almost half of their class. The opportunities for stockpiling food more than made up for the boredom of the classroom lectures and reading. Being in first year, though, also meant they could help their classmates with assignments. They had access to the Ellie's hive mind, after all, garnering friendship, and making it easier to blend in. Not to mention that being a year behind Ellie would add a year to their food gathering efforts. By then, their romantic restaurant should be able to take up the slack. Perhaps one of them could get into the maternity ward at St. Mungo's. That place would be a fountain of love. Or perhaps they should concentrate on their restaurant. It could be as worthwhile as the hospital. Especially if the restaurant offered a free babysitting service for parents with children under 11. They could collect the freely available emotion as the parents dropped off their children, enjoyed a romantic meal, and then picked their children up after. That would give them 3 opportunities instead of just the one with couples in a normal restaurant. Ellie had been startled at the number of ponies who had shown up at Hogwarts this year. She had hoped Harry and his herdmates would return, but planned for the opposite. As long as the twins kept throwing parties, she had no doubts she would be well fed. That the 4 had returned simply made things easier for her. That the princesses had committed so many ponies to learning wand magic indicated a sea change was coming in Equestria, and made her doubly glad she wasn't there. Having so many ponies at Hogwarts would make the chore of gathering food so much simpler, given how freely the ponies emoted. It wouldn't hurt to have an emergency stash that the Lings could fall back on if something went wrong, however. The wizarding stasis spell would prevent the stored food from spoiling. Not having such a spell on the other side of the portal had been one of the issues that had dragged down the hive. Plus, having a class size twice as big as normal made it easier to hide. 3 foreign students in a Hufflepuff class of 10 would draw everyone's attention. Any social mistakes they made would be noticed, and questions might be asked. But 3 in a class of 22? Plus, the transformed ponies would be making so many mistakes that any the Lings made would be ignored. Moreover, the house was delighted that they now had their own ponies to pet, and in a large enough number that arranging schedules wasn't a chore. More opportunities at collecting. One rather unusual occurrence was that the Weasley girl in Harry's herd was showing signs of jealousy. That wasn't odd, there was always a bit of jealousy in a herd. What made this different was her jealousy seemed to be aimed at the girl who had gained the Crystal Knight pony form. Whenever the girl came around in the Great Hall or elsewhere, either as a person or as a pony, Ellie could feel that little spike of yellow bleeding through. In the Gryffindor common room, even though the other girl was absent, Ginny was insisting that Harry spend an inordinate amount of time petting and cuddling with her. Well before curfew time, the 4 Lings were almost dizzy with what they had absorbed. Fortunately, everyone took the slightly dazed looks and not so steady walking as merely indications that the Lings were sleepy. At the first intimation of that from one of the others, Ellie had Earl give a big yawn, and then the other 3 copied him. It made a few of the Gryffindors yawn, too, causing a bit of laughter. The 4 started back to their dorm. A quick stop in the broom closet where they had placed the empty jars took care of the problem, and filled all 4 jars nicely. With the jars safely hidden in their robes, the Lings continued to their dorm, with none noticing their brief stop. Yes, Ellie decided, this year was off to a wonderful start. The best part, however, was that literally nobody suspected they were here and what they were doing. The Ling detection spells were simple precautions the ponies had convinced the humans to use. The minor alterations to their appearances didn't trigger any of the spells. It seemed that while they could transform with their magic, using this new ability to just rearrange things wasn't the same. The fact that the Lings could hide in plain sight without using any of their special magic was ironic, given the panic the ponies were in over Lings. The equestrian first years, most of whom were considered nerds in Equestria, hadn't taken long to develop a strategy for learning as much as possible. When they weren't in classes, they were in detentions. When they weren't in detentions, they were exploring the castle, the lake, the forest, just about everywhere where they weren't supposed to be exploring. Which usually garnered them detentions. In the afternoons, they took turns working on their assignments so no pony fell behind. What was interesting to Harry, however, was that the detentions, more often than not, were with Professors Flitwick, McGonagall, Sprout, and Slughorn. Rarely were the equestrians getting detentions in history or Dada Filch had discovered that having them help in his chores was a lesson in futility. No matter whether it was an earth pony, a Pegasus, or a unicorn, the pony just couldn't resist using magic. It was all unconscious, but it was there. And the messes Filch needed to clean had to be done without casting magic. The problem was sort of like handing someone a piece of paper with words on it and telling them to look at the paper but not to read the words. They automatically read it before they realize that's what they are doing. Listening into a few conversations, Harry discovered the new pony's reasoning about why the detentions weren't considered bad. A Slytherin upper year had apparently been trying to prank one of the new gullible Slytherin ponies and it had backfired spectacularly. She had quickly spread the word that she had a way to get extra lessons. Harry had to facepalm as he realized that the ponies were under the mistaken impression that the detentions were extra lessons, not punishments. They thought it weird that they had to misbehave to get the extra lessons, but then again, these were aliens. Who really knew how they thought? Detentionees got more individual instruction, and better, or at least more complete, answers to their questions with the extra time they spent with a professor or prefect. Of course, that was only after the students had helped the professors, or professorial aides, finish some of their chores. With the chores done early, the professors then had free time to devote to more instruction to the eager ponies. Having nearly 10 sets of hands at each detention meant any work was dealt with quickly and the ponies could concentrate on learning more. They could even help the professors in grading the assignments for the other students, once the professors explained what the assignments were supposed to teach. Combined with bookwalking, even if it was difficult to maintain for more than 5 minutes at a time for the first eyes, the ponies were rapidly outpacing the rest of their class in their understanding of what was being taught. Ambassador Sights, it is good to see you, Blueblood said, greeting his visitor at the door to his office. In deference to their equal status, he had changed into human form. It was also a subtle acknowledgement that while the United Kingdom was a noteworthy nation, at this point in time, the true power in the world was the United States of America. Raymond Sites was the U.S. ambassador to United Kingdom. Like most people in Britain and the U.S., he was a pale pink, what the humans all insisted in calling white. He was slight-built man, with white hair, formerly black, and a receding hairline that left him mostly bald. He combed his hair over to provide a light covering. His gold wire-framed glasses didn't hide his brown eyes. "What brings you to my humble office?" he said, guiding the man to a comfortable chair, and taking one opposite him, with a table to one side of their chairs. A tea set was already in place. "Would you like a cup?" After serving the tea and placing the saucers with their cups on the table by their elbows, Blueblood waited inquisitively. The man smiled and took an envelope out of coat pocket. "First, President Bush would like to invite Princesses Celestia, Luna, and Twilight to the White House next month." He leaned over and handed the envelope to the other ambassador. "Naturally, if that isn't possible, then perhaps in the spring?" Blueblood took the envelope in his magic and floated it to his desk. "I'm not sure the princesses could manage another visit on such short notice, but knowing my aunts, they would love another vacation. I will have this in Princess Celestia's hooves this afternoon." The American smiled again. "If you could let me know their response as soon as possible, that would be excellent. We could arrange a state visit reception in as little as a week." Blueblood nodded. "You said, first?" "Yes." He took on a more somber mien. "Second, we would like to invite you to open an embassy in Washington, the District of Columbia, as well as ask if we can open an embassy in Canterlot." Blueblood looked down for a moment. "While we do have plans to ask for an embassy with your fine country, we hadn't set any timetable to do so, as yet. At the moment, our hooves are full dealing with certain activities in the United Kingdom and the rest of the Commonwealth." He paused. "I will bring this to the attention of my aunts. Perhaps it would be beneficial to move those plans forward to next spring." He raised an eyebrow as he studied the other's reaction. "As for establishing an embassy in Canterlot, I'm afraid that we will have to put that off for a while." He leaned forward in his chair and looked intently at the ambassador. "Let me assure you, it's not because we have reservations about your country, it's that there are certain issues with crossing the portal." Sites looked at him questioningly. "I'm not sure if you know this, but your universe exists at a certain energy state. That is, there is a fundamental level of energy in your universe that represents the absolute bottom. You cannot go below that level." He stopped, thinking. "My universe exists at a slightly higher energy level." He paused again. "They are not that far apart, but the difference can be detected." The American nodded, although whether that was to encourage him to continue talking, or to signify he knew this information, Blueblood didn't know. "For us, the equestrians, to be here is harmless. Our extra energy might slowly lower to match your local level, but it is inherently harmless to us. One way this appears is that here, we have two forms, human and pony. At home, we have only the one form. Our experts, and the United Kingdoms, are struggling to understand this." He sighed. "The problem is, we don't know how being in our universe will affect your people. Will our higher energy levels slowly build up in your bodies, then level off until you return home? Or will you be unable to adapt and the energy will build up enough to interfere with your ability to cope, and you die? Or, will being in our universe cause damage to you such that when you return, your body will be unable to adapt back to normal, and, again, you die?" He stopped to see how the other ambassador was taking this. Not well, it appeared. It sounded like so much hot air, but he couldn't explain the issue better without bringing up magic. Unfortunately, the witchery statute of secrecy prevented that. "We are working with the British government, and volunteers, to test how long people may stay in our universe. So far, we have had volunteers for a PRD of only a year, and we have been unable to detect any ill effects in them. Except for those volunteers, no British staff have remained in Equestria for longer than 6 months." Ambassador Sites nodded in understanding, and frowned, thinking. He wasn't sure how much Sites believed him, but it was what it was until the witches went public. It would be a decade, or several, in any event, before any non-magical was allowed to stay in Equestria for more than a year. It might even be a century as they waited for the first volunteers to die of old age to make sure the exposure hadn't altered their lifespans. We would be willing to set up an embassy with a rotating staff, keeping stays limited to 6 months, if you have no objections, the site suggested. Blueblood nodded in turn. I will convey that suggestion to the princesses and get back to you. It would take a bit of juggling to arrange things so that the Americans would assume the British coming through the portal and becoming ponies were actually ponies to begin with. And to prevent American squibs or magicals from crossing. But it should be doable. He was sure other nations would soon approach with similar requests. They might have to extend Canterlot a bit more around the mountain to create an embassy row. Sight stared at him for a few moments, sighed, then said, I heard a rumor that you told a UN official that you have the capability to glass a country. Ambassador Blueblood smiled gently. You have the capability to use your nuclear missiles to glass any country in the world that you dislike. He took a sip of his tea. You have, in fact, used them to destroy 2 cities in another country in a war 40 years ago. Since then, you have threatened to use them against your enemies should they attack you. Why would you think we wouldn't have a similar capability? He tilted his head questioningly. Unlike humans, though, we are inherently peaceful and have no interest in expanding our territory, we have quite enough of our own that we haven't explored. Nor are my aunts interested in ruling over any other than their ponies. The princesses find Equestria quite enough to rule, why would they want to add more? It makes no sense to us, he continued. Quite frankly, we haven't an army big enough to take over a country. Our guard is more of a police force, so it is a moot point to bring up. We are fascinated, however, by the rich diversity of your cultures on this world. You have explored areas of endeavor that simply never occurred to us to pursue. Equestria is more of a monoculture, so the different viewpoints expressed in your science, art, writing, and movies, are absolutely enthralling to us. He straightened. That being said, we will defend ourselves if attacked. Our history has told us that the only way to respond to an attack is to eliminate the threat. Trying to stave off a war by placating the aggressor has never worked. Recently, a nation invaded Equestria and attacked Canterlot, intent on capturing it, planning to rule once they captured the princesses. They no longer exist except as scattered individuals, and their capital is in a wasteland. He leaned back in his chair. I doubt your government would have done anything different. Ambassador Sights slowly nodded. Blueblood smiled. You can relay to President Bush and his military advisors that we haven't the slightest interest in taking over any country, or this world. It's simply too much work for too little gain. We will even sign a non-aggression pact, should you so longing. Their meeting ended on a positive note a bit later. Your queen would be willing to let changelings cross over? Applejack said incredulously, pushing her Stetson back on her head. You did warn her how dangerous they are, right? Rarity said as she shivered. Rainbow Dash stared and shook her head in disbelief. But, why? She said plaintively. Twilight was frowning, deep in thought after reading the proposed oath. As I said, Twilight, Castor said confidently, this has the possibility of being greatly helpful to Her Majesty's government, and the United Kingdom. Plus, it would have a direct and immediate benefit to Equestria by decreasing the number of changelings your guards have to worry about harming your citizens. But they're dangerous, Fluttershy whispered, hiding behind Rainbow Dash. Castor nodded. Yes, they are, he said agreeably. However, based on what I've read, they are downright mediocre compared to some of the creatures in the wizarding world such as Lethifolds, Dementors, and vampires. The Mares all shuddered. They had all seen the fantastic creatures and Where to Find Them book. They were extremely pleased that none of those creatures existed in their world. Yes, compared to those monsters, Twilight said coming out of her thoughts with another full-body shiver, I suppose changelings are rather pedestrian. He shrugged his wings, they are certainly more intelligent and easier to bargain with in most cases. Besides, as long as a queen or proto-queen doesn't go through the portal, there isn't the opportunity for them to become a long-term problem even if they manage to find a loophole in the oath. Plus, we will screen the changelings as they go through to prevent that occurrence. Twilight stared down at the friendship map table, her brow furrowed, obviously back in deep thought. Finally, several minutes later, she looked back up. "All right, I'll back your plan to the princesses." She sighed. "It isn't fair to condemn them to a slow death because their own queen has abandoned them and ponies are afraid of them," she added softly. She glanced at the paper on the map table in front of her. "And this oath seems rather comprehensive and should protect you quite well." Then she grinned. "Plus, think of everything we'll learn by having a cooperative pair of changelings to examine and question." At their next double potions class, Slughorn intercepted Sweetie Belle and directed her to a workstation separate from the others and at the back of the classroom. Once she was seated, he cast an air-purifying charm like the bubblehead charm, but on an area instead of a person. Then he cast a shield charm around her. He smiled broadly. "There, that should keep you safe," he said. Sweetie Belle gave him a sour look. She didn't like being singled out like this. But, on the other hoof, considering the calamities inflicted on the class last year, and last week, perhaps she didn't have a good reason to complain. The rest of the herd gave her sympathetic looks, but they, like the rest of the class, were relieved that someone was finally taking precautions. There were no explosions, melted cauldrons, or any other unusual accidents. There were potions that bubbled when they shouldn't, and didn't when they should. Others turned colors that were not mentioned in the instructions for this potion. In short, it was what would be considered a normal class for any other group. For this group of Slytherins and Gryffindors, it was a unique experience, eerily like their previous potion brewing class, but not the same. The only thing that might have been considered unusual was that Sweetie Belle's potion was among the first finished. She bottled it in a vial, and carefully ensured that her station was safe to leave. Smiles broke out and heads nodded happily as they saw her headed towards the professor's desk to hand it in. Everyone quietly congratulated themselves on having escaped another Sweetie Belle incident. A few of the more exuberant ones were exchanging high fives or slaps on the backs. Harry saw her swat at a fly as she passed him. Dean Thomas, a table away, was giving his thick, green, soupy mixture a worried, puzzled look. It was supposed to be blue and thin. Harry heard a tiny ting as the insect hit the inside edge of Dean's cauldron, followed by a just as tiny plop as it fell inside the potion. Dean's frown deepened. He had seen something fall inside his cauldron. The potion turned silvery, Harry saw, and he heard a faint hiss. Dean grabbed his wand in a panic to turn off the flame, but instead hit the cauldron with it. Abruptly, there was a tremendous whoosh. A cloud of orangish something exploded across the room. Whatever had been in the cauldron was now blown throughout the class. No one was spared. Everyone was splashed with at least a little bit. There was a complete, stunned silence. Even Slughorn just stood there, blinking. Then the swearing began mostly under their breaths so they wouldn't get in trouble. Except Apple Bloom. "Oh, pony feathers," she exclaimed loudly. She had just been about to decant her potion into a vial. Dean's inadvertent dispersal of his cauldron's contents had contaminated everyone else's potion, except for the very few who had already sealed their vials. That woke Slughorn out of his shock. "I don't know what you said, young lady," scolded the professor, "but judging from your tone, it's something you shouldn't have said, 2 points. Harry could see Apple Bloom's lips moving as she swore some more, but this time quietly and to herself. Then the effects started to make themselves evident. It appeared rather mild. At first their skin slowly became rougher, more rigid. Within 5 minutes their skins had transformed into scales almost like fish, but appearing more textured and dragon-like. Seamus, a daring and stupid student that day, by Harry's reckoning, grabbed his silver knife and stabbed his arm. The scales didn't scratch. Scales that were quite tough, it seemed. They were also rather slippery, as everyone discovered when they went to pick something up only to drop it almost immediately. They had to grip things tightly. Quite a few students shattered their vials before someone got smart and started casting the unbreakable on their tools before picking them up. Apparently, their strength went up, too. Still, at dinner time, there were a lot of dropped utensils and goblets. There were just as many that were mangled, twisted, or crushed before people got the hang of balancing their grip with not leaving fingerprints in the metal. Professor Snape looked inordinately pleased at having missed out on this particular incident. He had also made it a point to acquire the memories of both Dean and Sweetie as they left the classroom. The twins were obviously impressed and had managed to talk Dean into sharing his memory with them. Galleons may have changed hands. It would be a race between the twins and Snape as to who would decipher it first. Harry was betting on the twins. They didn't have papers to grade and weren't shy about skipping classes if need be. They were also more willing to experiment with spells and potions, a risk most adult wizards would abhor. This time, the potion didn't start to wear off until the next morning. Quantity of exposure didn't have that great an effect. So alright folks, that's all for today. Stay tuned for part 52. Do subscribe, like and share for more such videos. Also check out the story and author tkepner on fanfiction.net. Press the bell icon to be notified first on release. See you in the next video. Till then, goodbye.